Welcome back to Beyond the Crime, the podcast that takes you into the minds of criminals with your hosts Dr. Lars Madsen, Shay Addison, and Dr. Rob Brockman.
Hello everyone and welcome back to Beyond the Crime, Psychological Analysis, a podcast that specializes in making sense of forensic issues and matters through a schema therapy lens. And today's podcast is going to be looking a little bit more at deception and lying in therapy. And this is part two of a two-part podcast where we initially interviewed in part one Don Grubin, a world-leading expert in lie detection and polygraph testing. So this is kind of like going to be a follow-up in terms of talking a little bit about some of the concepts we discussed with Don and thinking about the topic of lying and deception in therapy through a schema lens. And I've got my co-presenters here, Rob Brockman. Rob and I are in the same room. Hi, Rob.
Hey, mate.
And obviously Shay Addison. Hi, Shay.
Hey, Lars. Hey, Rob. I'm just down the hallway. Good to be back. I'm excited about today because I feel like this is a topic and a thing that I come up against pretty much every day working in a forensic clinic. So I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, and not something that you necessarily sort of come up against that often unless you're working forensically. I don't know that lying, the topic of deception and lying is an everyday thing for a more clinically orientated psychologist or therapist, but it's certainly something I think you guys have to deal with most days, how much you can trust the information that's coming your way. So very exciting.
Yeah, definitely. It is.
Yeah. So should we kick off with some sort of talk about how do we conceive of the behaviour of lying or deception from a schema point of view, from maybe a schema mode point of view? How do we conceptualize this kind of presentation, this kind of behaviour?
Well, I guess that, obviously one of the big modes that's relevant for forensic contexts is the conning manipulator mode, which is where, and that's something that I think if you work in forensics, you're probably dealing with this on a regular day-to-day basis, the conning manipulator mode, the side of someone, this mode that uses deception, deceit, manipulation to be able to achieve objectives and goals that they want, but they doing it in a way that is obviously through deception and manipulation. But that's not the only kind of, I think, deceptive mode that engages, I think, in lying either. I know we were talking just before we came on, Rob, you mentioned some other modes that you'd observed perhaps in some of the clinical practice that you had.
So I think the conning manipulator is the sort of obvious one, and it can, I think if you're being lied to, it could actually trigger something in us, like where we feel like, someone's conning you, or it can invoke a sort of trust thing on you, where you're sort of thinking someone else can't be trusted. In other words, you praise it as a sort of conning manipulative move. But I do think there are different forms of lying. Just for completeness' sake, I think there's a sort of white lie type variation, or even a benevolent lying. The sort of things you say to your kids, or the sort of thing, if your partner says, "Do I look fat in this?" That you got to be very careful about the truth.
Is that a healthy adult? Is that a healthy
in
adult?
other words, I'm putting out there could be a healthy adult version of fibbing, like a white lie.
We teach our kids that, don't we? We socialize our children to be kind through actually lying. So, if grandma comes along to Christmas and grandma's got a few wild whiskers on her lip and everything, you don't want children to go, "Oh, grandma, you've got a moustache." So you teach them to lie, to be kind, right? But
right. So if there's if you've got nothing nice to say, don't say it at all. But that can also be taken a bit further to actually. Well, sometimes you get involved in a situation where you might be telling a bit of a fib, like so that someone's feelings aren't hurt. So that could be a bit of a. I would argue that can be a healthy adult thing. It's about maintaining social harmony, connection. Other people's self-esteem.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think there's room for that. But putting that aside,
and I think also like with that kind of like sometimes perceptions are just that, your perception, right? Like, I mean, it may or may not be accurate, your perception about whether someone is fat, skinny, attractive, not attractive, that kind of thing. Like, I mean, sort of being able to kind of, I don't know, am I justifying it? Being able to sort of conceptualize that, well, maybe the ground truth isn't always what your opinion about things are. So maybe withholding that opinion or kind of putting it out to pasture rather than expressing it at every opportunity is like a sensible thing to do, a healthy thing to do, or one that, like you said, promotes social harmony and self-esteem and relationships.
No, so you're talking, Lars, a little bit like lying by omission.
Lying by omission, yeah, maybe.
No, still
right,
lying.
like leaving out some truth or the details.
Yeah, it's a version of lying because it's very conscious. People know they're doing it, right? But it's through omission.
So this leads to sort of maybe the second form of lying, and I actually think there might be two versions of this. One version is about, I would call it the avoidant protector. So it's lying to avoid basically schema activation. So, to tell the truth would invoke sort of you to feel scared or vulnerable, put you in a vulnerable position, or maybe invoke a lot of shame or something like that, to face the truth. I think you guys might deal with this quite a lot, actually, because in the context of people who might have done some pretty full-on offences, they often don't want to talk about that. There can be a sort of avoidance of that, which is just a pure avoidance, like not wanting to feel that in the room.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the if you kind of flick it back to the CBT, what most people would understand around cognitive distortions, right? We call them that in treatment, but they're often designed. The mechanism of the design is that they're not truthful ways of looking at things, and they can be outright deceitful. But it's a way of protecting someone from shame or protecting someone from bad feelings. There's a part of them that definitely knows they did what's been documented, but it's very difficult for them to acknowledge it. So you'll have these versions of things which are not truthful. But it's a key part of treatment, with forensic clients, is to help them understand how to understand that. And in schema therapy, it would be a version of a conning manipulator, but for a different motivation, perhaps, rather than someone who's outwardly maybe being deceitful, not necessarily because they feel bad, but for different reasons.
So there's lying to sort of to cover your ass in a way, so that things aren't hitting the fan, kind of thing. And then maybe there's another version which is more like self-protection or to protect a self-image or to boost your self-image. The sort of lying where maybe it's a bit more like an aggrandizer.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think one of the things that you can definitely come across is two versions of it. Think of an aggrandizer that I've certainly encountered with clients. One is just this out and out kind of quite psychopathic, what we call duping delight, which is where it's a game.
The duping delight, same old words.
Yeah, it's a game, right? It's like cat and mouse. It's like, I'm cleverer than you. I'm gonna win, about winning. So it's definitely about that getting on top. And it doesn't really, the more outrageous or whatever it is, it doesn't really matter.
Do you have some cases where you can? Because I certainly have some cases where I think clients have engaged in that kind of duping delight, self-aggrandizing, kind of I'm smarter and cleverer than you, and this is a bit of a game for me.
Yeah, and sometimes, depending on their presentation, it can be a bit obvious that that's what's going on. Like you can feel it in the room that, okay, this person's actually quite, underneath it all is quite a threat there, or, that they need to sort of overcompensate.
They're more kind of grinning, you get that sort of transference.
But then with some forensic clients, which are actually far more riskier people and harder to figure that stuff out with, is only in retrospect. Sometimes I've had a client that Lars knows that I worked with for a very long time, who was very sincere and very, very seemed to be compliant and would provide lots of detailed information. And you couldn't, there were no holes in anything. It all seemed to be going ahead. And then, one day, years down the track, it all unraveled and it turned out that, probably, I don't know, 80% of perhaps the things that he'd reported for many years were completely made up. And I mean, detailed made up, and so he was, his formulation was feeling very overpowered by the system, but so he would quietly, but with a Cheshire cat type of thing, like compliantly agree to everything, but really it was all deceit, and it was very much about him being, well, I'm actually smart.
You.
And
I'm outsmarting everyone.
Right?
Yeah.
It's more advanced. It's more.
But I think that part of the self-aggrandizer was also part of it. It just perhaps wasn't in your face self-aggrandizer. I think it served a purpose for him to feel powerful and like he was winning against the system, i.e. the correctional system.
That's a presentation I've had a number of, and in the last year, I would say I've had a number of clients I've worked with where things have eventually come out about their behaviour and about what they've been up to, where they've been in therapy for 6 months, and then you sort of work out, well, this, when you track back, going, okay, well, you've been doing this since for the last 5 months, and hiding this. Interestingly, when I've had the opportunity with these clients to be able to process what this was about, how did you do this? Why was this such a compelling thing to do? A lot of the time it was around, on the one hand, well, this is what I felt like doing. So there's an impulsive child element. But another part of it was this sense of, well, I'm going to screw the system. Like, you think you can control me, I'm going to show you, So there'd be this real sense of, I'm enjoying having this discussion with my case manager where you think you've controlled me, but I'm actually controlling you.
Through the deception.
Yeah, and that's the sense of feeling, I've turned the tables on you and you don't know it. And that feels good. Or that feels...
Yeah, I think we definitely have a cohort of people that we work with who are extremely good at being in this mode for long periods of time. I mean, the wheels fall off the wagon eventually,
So and the idea is that there's a part that lies. Yeah. So yes. when the behaviour is happening, there's a part that's doing the deception.
Yes.
But there's also a part, I guess what Lars was just saying, where there's other behaviour involved. Sometimes the modes are in cahoots with another or covering for another. So there could be something like an impulsive child mode or a self-soother that might be doing a substance or doing some other behaviour. And then there's a mode such as, it could be avoidant protector, it could be self-aggrandizer, it could be cunning manipulator, that will cover for or lie about the impulsive behaviour. So in that ways too, the modes can work together.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the mode sequence, when you're trying to, when it all does come out, and then you have to the person has to re-engage, and we get the chance to go through, okay, well, I've had it, the empathic confrontation is always very useful in that sense, because you've actually been a part of the system that's been deceived. So it's quite helpful to be able to then, in a healthy way as a therapist, harness that as a real learning opportunity, because it's not then just a reference point about, well, I've done this in the past because of this. It's like, actually, I was part of that. Your behavior impacted me as well. And I'm genuinely trying to help you. And I couldn't see the signs. Like, I didn't pick it up. So how do we, if we're moving forward, managing risk, and you're ever going to get out of jail or get off the order or whatever it is that they want, how is that possible?
So this is a reality then for therapists working in the field, that you'll be swindled. Like, from time to time, definitely. There'll be one that's just, I guess everyone's been swindled before.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, my favorite saying, context is king. I mean, I think when people are in punitive, they experience the management environment as punitive, they're much more likely to revert to those modes to get their needs met. And especially guys who've got a big lonely child, the typical thing with sexual offending, if they meet someone in their world that suddenly, it feels good and there's a bit of a connection and, makes them feel good, they're meant to report that, or they're not meant to be pursuing that without the system's knowledge. Very much a case of the conning manipulator comes in because, the need that they want to get met, is that need, the lonely child doesn't want to be lonely anymore. So we end up in these scenarios where people have maintained relationships with people, in being deceptive to everybody. but it's trying to get those needs met. It's just doing it in a way that deceives the system and then ultimately shoots themselves in the foot, because everybody then feels like, wow, we were all duped. Where do we go from here? How do you deal with that? It's difficult.
So like in clinical settings where I work, the deception's usually a part of an avoidance type thing, not so much with the conning thing. So people would deny, even they have self-deception. They'll deny that there's a problem, or they'll deny knowing about bad memories. Everything's okay.
Yeah.
I don't know. So there can be a level of deception that's about avoidance or detachment.
Yeah. But is that really, that's not really, I don't know. What do you think? Is that conning manipulated, those terms?
No, not at all. No, exactly. Yeah. So this is more, so I'm dealing more in clinical settings with, what might look like lying at times that's to do with just avoidance of affect and avoidance of getting triggered. And that's... Yeah,
I've got some clinical clients who might engage in risky behaviours like self-harming behaviours who feel shame if they've actually done that. And they might just kind of deny. You might ask a question, they might deny it, which is not truthful, but it's, because of shame and trying to deal with that rather than trying to dupe me or have that more get on top. Yeah, correct. Definitely.
So what do you do? Well, I mean, what do you lean on as a sort of set of strategies, Shay, when that's in the room or when you realise that that's a very real thing? What do you guys lean on, to deal with that more conning type context?
Yeah, I guess it's my first go-to, I suppose, is the empathic confrontation with someone, especially if you've worked with them for a while or a long time. I think you've got the sort of, money in the bank to be able to do that quite easily. And I think understanding the personality profile also about often with, serious forensic clients is the self-interest is really important as leverage, right? So it's the empathic confrontation around if you want to get out of prison or you want to get off this order, this part of you that continues, this habitual part of relying on this mode to get your needs met, to manage things, is in fact you can do it and you're very, very good at it and no one can pick it. That is true. But ultimately, every single time you've been caught, it unravels. It's actually not doing you any favors. It's trying to,
in the long run,
trying to motivate them to see the long-term goals are the ones that they need to be focused on rather than the short-term.
So you lean a lot on your empathic confrontation, sort of pulling them up about it, making them aware of this mode and its costs.
And the other, and when you're working with people in the system, it's also making sure you've got as best monitoring and collateral information you can, really, because with people that struggle to manage their own behaviour, you want to pick things up, help them pick things up early rather than when it's too late.
And that's because you're going to know when they're deceptive. Like if you have more collateral information, you can kind of use that to pull them up.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see, well, is this consistent? Is what they're telling me the same as what they're telling other people? Or are there unusual things that might be happening in their behaviour or what they're doing that I'm like, wow, okay, well, that's a bit, I need to figure out what that's about. And if you don't have that information, again, you become overly reliant on self-report in the room. And when you have a client that has for a very long time relied on their conning manipulator to kind of get their needs met, and it's a very active part, that's just it's just not helpful in terms of managing forensic clients. You have to have a lot better information.
And
they
what are
also
your
know
favourite
that.
words for this mode? Like I have my own, but I imagine they don't like the word the conning manipulator. Like, how do you sell this?
Yeah, no, because offenders are often referred to as manipulative, right? And they see it as quite punitive. It's the sneaky part, the part that has to be sneaky, the part that's got to go it alone often. So I have guys that have a lonely child, where they've grown up in an impoverished emotional environment. They just had to go it alone. So they wanted to get stuff. They had to lie to their
one-man wolf. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you're like, okay, well, you're kind of going it alone here again. You're taking your chances here.
I've had some success calling it the chess player.
The chess player. Yeah. Actually, Lars created a cool schema therapy card with that image
with
on
the
it.
chess guy on it.
Yeah. And also he's got one with a person with a puppet on a string type of thing, like the puppet master pulling the strings.
Puppet master type of thing.
Yeah. So there's different ways to conceptualize it, but I do think it's really helpful for the client to come up with their own label for it.
There's another topic around this, like as therapists, because you got to be aware that conning might be a part of it, but it can also lead to a sort of cynicism in the field. And over time, therapists can get quite cynical or jaded, if you expect people always to lie to you. So let's reflect on that for a sec. There's something there about working with these guys that is different. So let's start first. How do you feel in the room with transference? What's it like being in the room with someone who, when you're thinking, am I being duped?
Yeah, look, it's difficult because there's a tendency towards me, flipping into my obsessive over-controller, right? And then you want to interrogate someone. And that's not very helpful.
Interrogation mode.
Because you want all the information, right?
Is this true? You're bullshitting.
Right. And let's get down to the weeds.
And nail you down.
Exactly. And you're like, well, that's, it's not really helpful. It's not really therapy, is it? But partly how I try to think about it with people I know, some of my clients who really have problems in this area have a very large way of functioning like this, is to just try to be authentic about how I feel about it, saying, I want to believe what you're saying. There's also, I got to admit that there's the history. Because of the history, there's a part of me that is sort of always thinking, I've got to keep in check that I don't know if it's true. And that's hard for me. And I know it's got to be hard for you. And trying to have those conversations, because I think when you work in forensics, you can't be disingenuous and say, oh, okay, now we've gotten over that, I completely believe you, because that's actually not true. It's not how I do see these people. But there is also a part of me that genuinely wants to believe them. And I don't want them to have the experience that they're constantly having to defend themselves. But it's very difficult because the system gets cynical, right? So people who have case managers who've, been lied to by who knows how many people constantly, it's protective for them to be super cynical, right? But it's not actually helpful in how to manage people. And that's to
help people heal. So that it is a sort of straddling, like a balance, isn't it?
I use the boy who cried wolf type of scenario, as in, people kind of understand that, as in if you do think something so many times, it alters the trust and the perception of people. So really trying to help them have conversations with that part of them on the chair about the broader, more nuanced, complicated consequences that mode has. Because when you have clients that are on orders for 10 years, you get the chance to do that, right? Because it's like, if this guy's in charge for the next 10 years, we're going to have a lot of problems.
And if you've got the rapport, can you be a bit straighter with people about the confrontation? To say, look, my bullshit radar's on, I don't know. I'm calling bullshit, or, is there room to be a lot straighter with folks about how you're feeling?
Yeah, I think there is. I think if you work with people for a long time, and I think with the more people that have sort of higher psychopathy traits, actually, I think being direct like that actually is a useful strategy. Just being really transparent and clear with people and being authentic, saying, listen, that just sounds like BS to me. I can get why you might be putting that forward, but it just doesn't sit right. So what do we do about that? Yeah, I think that's a definite strategy. And I think some forensic guys who've been in the system for a long time and they've got a big mistrust and abuse schema and conning manipulator, they get triggered and they don't trust things unless you are quite straight. They don't trust.
Because it's funny, in regular therapy, it's commonplace that you're struggling with this thing in the room where the client is trying to build trust with you, or you're trying to have some trust, being built in the relationship, but the client doesn't trust us, right? And that's how they experience us. So they're sort of like, can I trust this guy? But in the therapy you guys do, it's kind of inverted. So at least, you're also in there thinking, can I trust this guy? And so
totally. Yeah.
then you've got actually, it's sort of like a two-way thing. I'm sure the client is still thinking that too, because they're not trusting you enough to be genuine.
No,
So
that's right.
there's a dual process there in a
is
practice.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Rob. And I think you also we have a combination with forensic clients of just, very explicit conning, manipulated, lying deliberately to avoid punishment, to get things you're not entitled to, etc. But there's a large part of it also is people just don't understand themselves well. So again, they're also trying to avoid being triggered, also trying to avoid feeling bad. So you have a lot of that stuff
wrapped up in avoidance as well, and control and affect.
Yeah.
Do you find these guys that are big on the conning manipulator behaviour, they tend to have problems with guilt regulation, meaning they don't experience much of a sort of critic.
So they don't feel guilty. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or they don't tend to be hard on themselves for lying. Or, I mean, a lot of the clients I have, wouldn't lie very much because they just feel terrible. Like, they're in a critic and get set off. I mean, no. I'm imagining these guys don't have really strong inner critics, or maybe
no, they don't.
Deficit in this sort of critic experience or interject. They don't tend to have that as much.
Yeah, no, I would say that's true. That the capacity for genuine empathy for the impact on other people is quite impaired, I would say, in a lot of guys. And the higher the kind of antisociality, the higher the psychopathy type of stuff, the more so that often is. So it's not, and that's why in therapy with guys with those traits, empathy training is actually not something that's recommended, pretty much, because it's actually not something that has been shown to enhance treatment for those guys. It's more about self-interest. You've got to leverage self-interest rather than try to appeal to care for others.
Pro-sociality, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But that's not the case for all offenders. There are actually a lot of offenders who have a well-developed capacity for empathy, right? But there's just a proportion that don't as well. And once you work with someone for a decent period of time, you definitely have a good sense of who's who in the zoo in that regard.
I guess leading on from that, it's been my observation that, for people working in this field or working oftentimes with psychopathic clients and clients with a lot of traits around conning and manipulation, it can sort of lead to sort of a burnout sometimes in therapists. Who might become quite jaded or cynical about clients over time, right? Like, can I trust anyone? Here we go again. All clients, they're going to be manipulative. Can that be an issue? And how might we overcome that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think people can feel burned by it, because they're individuals. I'd also think people working in systems are at a specific risk of being, being constantly in sort of like a paranoid over-controller when they're dealing with offenders. Because if you get something wrong in the system, like you miss a risk sign or you miss something, in systems, sometimes the culture of correctional systems is such that feels really threatening to staff,
like
especially
if punished or something.
Like you're kind of, you're diminished in some way because you got it wrong, rather than, well, you're working in a forensic correctional environment. I mean, this is just a part of what happens, so people can personalize it in that way. And it can be an unconscious thing in my experience. They don't even really realize that's what's going on. So they're hypervigilant. What they do is they become hypervigilant, right? So they sit in this kind of paranoid over control.
Particularly like a healthy environment to work in.
No, and I think, the level of supervision required and the level of support that staff require is actually extremely high, because it is inevitable that you will get staff who are just burnt out and become very cynical, and the filter of everything everyone says is a lie potentially, and that's how they start interactions, which isn't very helpful.
So I wonder if you could, because I'm thinking about people I've seen. I'm thinking about, for example, police officers or emergency services workers who over time get a sort of cumulative trauma, and because they see so many accidents, so much crime, so many problems, and they end up with a sort of vulnerability to harm schema over 30 years of working.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And they'll be like, the world is dangerous. And where that wouldn't have been the case when they were fresh and young and green.
Definitely.
And they sort of pick up a schema over time. They kind of get jaded and they get affected by all the trauma they've seen. But I wonder if the same thing wouldn't happen to you guys.
Yeah, look, I think, Rob, that's a very, very valid point. And part of the reason, I mean, just on a personal level decision, two things I suppose that Lars and I have done over the years and recognised as very important is, one is we share some of the more highlier, it's not even a word.
Highlier.
Highest
of the highest.
Clients that have a real psychopathic, pathological lying type traits, the real conning, manipulate, deliberate, sustain, difficult to overcome. We share clients like that. We have shared back and forth over the years because the system's allowed us to do that, because there is a sense of you can get ground down by that. The other thing also is that both of us have always maintained a clinical client load as well. It's never just, we don't just have.
I think that's important.
We don't just have pure forensics because of that reason.
Balance of folks,
because your perception becomes skewed about what psychology is, right? Because if all you're practicing is that really pointy end of psychology.
I think you're onto something with that. I think you're going to have maybe your caseload balanced out a bit. Where you've got a bunch of people, you might have poor old lady Janine, who's a self-sacrificer, who does too much for others, and and balance out your caseload a bit, where you're not just drilling down with these people who might be highly deceptive. Yeah, absolutely.
And that was a very deliberate, conscious choice of ours many years ago, because it's like, wow, there's only so much of that's healthy for us to be able to take, and you can't be as effective as you otherwise would be when all you deal with is that. You need to see the breadth of the spectrum of human beings.
And is Lars the same? Like, is he doing the same kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. And we always look at our diaries and always kind of like, wow, have I got too much of this? I need to maybe, can I transfer, can we swap a client across, or, what do I need to do to make sure that my caseload is kind of mixed in a healthy way for us, well, for me, for him as therapists? Because I don't think I could be as effective if I just had a full diary full of folks like that.
Hardcore forensic load.
Yeah, I think that I just don't think that that's possible, really, for me anyway.
Hopefully there's some cool guidance there on, how to manage these things and getting a lot of supervision and peer support.
Yeah. The thing I think, Rob, is that it's difficult for people that work within a correctional system or community corrections or whatever, because literally that is just the only clients they see.
That's it. So then that's what I mean. The system's kind of unhealthy in that way.
Yeah, it is. And people that only go in and they start work in that system and they don't work anywhere else, they don't have the benefit of having perhaps worked in
sometimes you speak to people and they're just literally in either like, well, I'm in the violent offenders unit or I'm in the sex offenders unit. And it's just so intensely the same thing.
Yes, it is. And I think if you do that for a long enough time, I think it's inevitable that you kind of have to get some sort of skewing of how you see psychology as well, right? Because
and even just how you see humanity.
Yeah, that's right. And it doesn't match the breadth of humankind. I think it's important to, as a self, sort of healthy mechanism for practice, I think that stuff's important. I don't know how much access other people have, in those systems sometimes to supervision outside of it, to perhaps get those perspectives.
Makes sense.
Hopefully they're listening to the pod.
Yeah. So, look, I think we've given it a good go of all things schema, modes, deception, lying, conning manipulator.
I had one more thing, Rob, sorry to interrupt you, which I thought you might have you definitely have way more experience than me in this, but this is where I think in a clinical context, your conning manipulator might definitely be relevant a lot of the time, and that's in marriage infidelity.
Yeah.
So not a forensic issue, but for people who have had sustained affairs, for example.
Yeah. It does come up. It does come up from time to time. I've often wondered what it's about. Like, it often just seems to be quite, I often haven't looked at it really as a conning manipulator thing.
Okay.
It's usually been something like, so a common thing might be, John is with whoever, right? His partner's Jackie, and they've got these 3 kids, and over time, the lady is, Jackie is overwhelmed and just trying to deal with being a mum and not really there for the guy, and the relationship struggles in a certain way, but it's a stable family situation, and the guy benefits from that, and he likes having a family, and he likes the stability of the relationship and the stability of having a family, and so that meets a kind of need. Maybe the guy's an abandonment schema, but at the same time, it's missing a lot in terms of the intimacy and maybe the emotional deprivation piece over time, and so starts looking elsewhere for a partner, or someone who can meet that other need.
Yeah.
And so that's
or they just respond to someone in their environment that makes them feel warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, who's interested in them
and
isn't angry with the kids and
and
so there can be that sort of thing where people get into that situation, and then so I don't know, like I've usually looked at that, and then the lying ends up being quite, I think, mainly avoidant, like so that they're trying to sort of get a need met in a certain way, by splitting things up or splitting their bets each way. And I've been tempted to look at it mainly as avoidance. I know you can easily see it too as a conning manipulator thing, and maybe it is. Well, it just seems very different from the kind of guys that you would deal with.
Yeah,
where
it's
that
not deceit though. There's still deceit there.
Oh yeah,
but think about you. I don't know if you've seen this case in the paper recently. They've just charged this man. He's a RAF pilot with murder, and his wife was a psychologist. Actually, she was found dead. So before they charged him, they did a press release saying that they'd found out, like, she's married, they got 3 adult children, that he had relationships with women literally all over the world, and they named all the countries, and there's like a long list, So, and this guy had won accolades in the Air Force, and
that feels very prolific.
So that feels different,
like,
right? That feels
closer to the conning manipulator.
Yeah,
so, where that sounds pretty prolific. And I guess so that there's different levels to the conning manipulator as well. It doesn't have to be this big forensic thing, and it can be something that sort of creeps up in a particular context as well. So I think that's one of them. And
I think related to some of the other clients I have too around pornography access, like men that have lots of problems with that, there's definitely this mode is in action because their partners just have no idea until, again, sort of like, the shit hits the fan, so to speak. And what you see is that this stuff's been concealed in very deliberate but sustained ways.
So there's a kind of underground, right? Like sometimes things go underground.
Yeah.
So that's the sort of way I look at it.
It's a siloed way. I have another case which I'd like to sort of mention, see what you guys think. Like, I worked with a guy over a long period of time in custody, and he was on one of these orders where it just kept being repeated in terms. He remained in detention, and because he was considered high risk or too dangerous to sort of be managed in the community. And then when I started working with him, it became really apparent that his initial engagement with me was this cold, detached, really very, he seemed almost like this kind of, sort of prototypical psychopathic character from a movie, right? But as I got to know him over time, he softened quite a bit. Right. Now, I know that some folks might say, well, he's starting to manipulate you. But what became apparent over time is really that actually he wasn't in any way this kind of psychopathic and callous and cruel kind of guy. But he was presenting like that when he was getting these evaluations from people who were evaluating. And when I started to ask him, what was this about? He says, well, that's who they see me as. And, when they come in here and they evaluate me, they look at me, they judge me harshly, and, they don't give me a fair go. And it's like, well, I just give them what they want then. I'm just gonna be the guy that they think I am. So he comes in there and he says all the wrong things, quite knowingly. He says all the, yes, I'm like this, and this is why I did it, and this is what I think. But when you get to know him, he's like, well, this is, I'm only doing that because I'm kind of doing an FU to the assessors, because they think you think you know me, but, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a big compliant surrenderer?
Well, that's what I'm thinking.
Mode
Like it
on
almost feels like it is like I'm just surrendering to this idea that I think that you have of me.
Just tick the boxes.
Yeah, I'm going to be this guy. I don't care. I'm
giving up on trying to sort of fight my case or put my case forward. I'll just give up on that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just go along with it.
Yeah, I just go along with it. I will pretend I'll be it that you want me to be. And so
yeah, okay. So that's interesting. A different variety.
Surrender, hopeless surrenderer form of deception, right? Isn't it? Or lying.
Passive aggressive, isn't it? Really,
it's passive aggressive, isn't it?
Definitely. Yeah.
Like, like, and I guess in that kind of and for him, and I guess that what he took from it as well was this sense, well, you think you know me, but you don't, so F you. You will never know me. It's my last vestige of power and control.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you can write your big reports and have your big opinions, but you don't know me.
And that feels a bit self-aggrandizing, doesn't it?
It does actually on some level.
Yeah.
On some level feels a little bit self-aggrandizing. Yeah. So you've got like multiple sort of those.
There's a new English word.
Self-aggrandizing.
Self-aggrandizing.
Self-aggrandizing. All right, guys. I think we've covered as many things as we can, all things deception, lying, and schema lens. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll get back to you soon with our next episode. Thanks. See you guys.
Thanks Rob. Thanks, Shay.
Thanks, Lars. See you later.
Get hands-on experience with schema therapy at the Forensic Schema Sessions live training. Visit psychclinic.com.au/workshops for more information.